Thank you to the Governor's Office of Volunteerism and NJVOAD for convening this important conference and for inviting us to be part of it. I'm Linda Czipo, President and CEO of the New Jersey Center for Nonprofits, the statewide network and champion for and about our state's charitable nonprofits. Through advocacy, education, management assistance, convenings, and member services, we strengthen New Jersey's nonprofit community to improve the quality of life for all people of our state.
And I'm Theresa, Acting President and CEO of the Council of New Jersey Grantmakers. The Council is a nonprofit leadership organization for New Jersey's philanthropic sector, providing knowledge building, networking, research, advocacy, and connection. We've worked closely with our sister organization, the New Jersey Center for Nonprofits, for many years.
We're honored to kick off this panel discussion about reimagining the partnerships between philanthropy and nonprofits to address long-standing power imbalances and fortify community engagement and impact. A strong and thriving nonprofit community is essential to a strong and thriving New Jersey for all of our residents.
As part of the partnership between our organizations, we first embarked upon Doing Good Better in 2014 to confront the power dynamics between nonprofits and grantmakers, dispel the overhead myth, and promote full cost funding. We knew we couldn't create real long-term change by working in silos.
And strong partnerships between nonprofits, philanthropy, government, and the community are pivotal to our shared goals of engaged, vibrant, resilient communities, uplifting and improving people's lives every day at every stage. But long-standing underlying tensions have made already difficult work even harder than it has to be. For too long, nonprofits have long been challenged by a climate in which the funds and resources lag behind the skyrocketing demands for their programs and services. And we've all seen how the past 2.5 years have laid bare, and in some cases is exacerbated, critical vulnerabilities and racial and social inequities in our society and in our own sector.
However, the events of the last few years seem to be a tipping point. The Me Too movement, the whole country witnessing the tragic killing of Mr. Floyd and other Black and Brown people, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the global pandemic. As part of the Council's work in response to these difficult times, we asked New Jersey foundations to sign on to the Council on Foundations Call to Action Pledge, encouraging philanthropy to provide more flexible funding, loosen restrictions on grants, and unburden nonprofit partners so they could spend their time and energy responding to the COVID-19 crisis.
In response to the pandemic, we saw nonprofits and philanthropy step up in a big way. We saw philanthropy and government change their practices in ways that, quite frankly, nonprofits have been requesting for quite some time. Honest dialogue, transparency, flexibility in grant making and use of funds, multi-year grants, increased payouts due to the emergency, intentional commitment to racial equity and social justice, and much more. And we saw nonprofits embrace and channel these practices into responsible, impactful work.
COVID has shown us it's possible to work differently. We saw philanthropy change and adjust their practices in response to COVID, and nothing fell apart. But since the pandemic peaked, we've also seen many funders revert back to more restrictive practices and business as usual, while nonprofits are continuing to struggle with financial uncertainty, stretched capacity, and a volatile external landscape.
These issues aren't new, and indeed, the New Jersey Center for Nonprofits and the Council of New Jersey Grantmakers have been working to tackle them together for many years, both looking at immediate solutions and long-term systemic change. Our challenge and opportunity is to equalize the power dynamic between philanthropy, nonprofits, and communities, and to build on the practices that have previously been the hallmarks of emergency response.
So all of that has brought us to today. The New Jersey Center for Nonprofits and the Council of New Jersey Grantmakers are together in partnership, embarking upon a vitally important journey to reimagine how New Jersey nonprofits and philanthropy can work together. We're calling it Doing Good Better, amplifying and deepening philanthropic and nonprofit partnerships in New Jersey.
We could go on, but our moderator and panelists will definitely say it better. We are thrilled to introduce Lois Greco, our moderator for this important conversation.
Lois is one of New Jersey's most thoughtful, strategic, and experienced philanthropic veterans. Her many hats make her the perfect guide for this discussion. She's board vice chair of the Community Foundation of South Jersey and grants and program officer at the Raskob Foundation. You can read her full bio on the conference platform. We're deeply grateful for Lois's commitment to this work. Lois, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Theresa and Linda, both for the background and the context setting for this conversation, but also for backboning this important initiative for our state's social sector. So again, Lois Greco, and I'm really delighted to be here. As we began this, what I refer to as version 2.0 of this movement following the COVID and racial unrest, we knew we needed to include the voices from the field. And so we developed a broad-based advisory group with balanced representation from both the social sector and foundations to give us their candid thoughts about opportunities and challenges ahead as we seek to make this the best work that it can be. And so today we've invited some members of the advisory group to share their thoughts in a conversation. I'd like to take a moment to introduce them to you. Joining us from the nonprofit lived experience are George Cruz, who is the director of LISC of Greater Newark, which is a community development organizations helping neighborhoods have the foundational requirements for healthy, resilient communities. We have Mark Valli, who is the executive director of NORWESCAP, providing a vast array of programs and resources for people and businesses to foster a resilient community within Hunterdon, Sussex, and Warren counties. And then joining us from the Foundation Lived Experience are Jackie Edwards, Vice President of Strategic Engagement at the Pascale Sykes Foundation, and Samantha Plotino, Executive Director of the Provident Bank Foundation. So thank you. We'll start with our thanks and really appreciate your joining us today. I've invited them each to share a line or two about their organization in their opening responses, but so their full bio is included in the conference material. So let's start the conversation. Having heard of the initiative as outlined by Theresa, and tell us why it matters to New Jersey people and communities. Why did you agree to join it, and why is the urgency? I'm going to start with Mark.
Well, thanks, Lois. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. You know, NORWESCAP, we serve the 5 northwest corners of the state, and we really provide a vast, wide, diverse portfolio of services, everything from education to job training to housing and community development. And we've been around since 1965. And I think the reason I'm excited about this panel is that in my 25 years or so of experience in the New Jersey nonprofit community, you know, we for so long have, you know, worked with the philanthropic sector, written grants that we thought aligned with their values and their mission, and oftentimes found ourselves sort of letting the tail wag the dog, chasing the funds so that we could add a new program on top of our already existing program portfolio. And while it was wonderful, and while it did at times sort of help us add some program elements that maybe we wouldn't have thought of or wouldn't have pursued if we didn't have the funding, I think that oftentimes it really forced organizations to go after funding that really would have been better spent on other initiatives that built the organizational capacity to manage its work and produce better outcomes. And to me, it's all about producing the outcomes. So what is the organization? What is its mission? What is it intending to do? And are you, as a funder, helping to fund it? I'm going to tell one silly story and then give the mic back to you. When I remember back in the, I think it was the Corzine governor's race, I recall there was like $65 million spent during that race, which at the time was outrageous. Now it's probably chump change. But I remember having a very boring fantasy that wouldn't it be great if that $65 million was put into a fund that would then support nonprofit CFOs, and only nonprofit CFOs. I mean, nothing else, because the finances are the heart to a healthy organization. So maybe it's a boring fantasy, but nobody really funds the CFO in a nonprofit, and certainly doesn't fund it to the extent that you need a high quality financial mind serving as the backbone of a healthy nonprofit. So that's my boring fantasy, and I think it's directly relevant to this topic.
Thank you. George.
So thanks, Lois, and that's a great way to get things going here. So I serve as the New Jersey director of the Local Initiative Support Corporation. So we are a national nonprofit community development financial institution. I know that's a mouthful. So by way of context, while we are nonprofit, we are in fact a grant maker. So we spend most of our time directing different forms of capital, grant capital to debt capital. So we're not a direct service provider like NORWESCAP or our nonprofit partners that we work directly with. But at the same time, we, as a CDFI, as an intermediary, sort of similar to how United Way functions, we have to go out and get money to deploy money, right? So we're working in good part with a lot of the same funders and investors that Mark and our other nonprofit partners are working with. So, to the question of why we became interested and involved with this, well, number one is there's some selfish interest here. We wanted to see those sort of trust-based principles applied so that we can reap the benefits as an organization, right? Number one. Number two is for a very long time, and we take the L in our name very seriously, local, right? So we very much believe in shared power and shared leadership. In fact, we've developed a distinct program area around community voices, where we invest and fund programs and organizations that consider the building of resident leaders, resident power building within the scope of their work, right? So when we take that up and kind of upstream it to what we're talking about here, we're really talking about overall what our respective roles are in building local ecosystems, right? And when we talk about building local ecosystems, we're talking about different sectors working together. And together is the most critical word. So the third reason why we were interested in this is having more funders and more grant makers, like the Provident Foundation with Samantha here and Pascale Sykes with Jackie here, to understand that, getting the sort of impact that we all care about, and the communities we care about, is really driven by being at the same table at the same time. And so that's really the core factors driving our interest. And above all, working to invest in the nonprofit sector. Clearly we sit directly within that sector, but most of our time, all of our time, is driven by what we can do to invest and build the capacity of our nonprofit organizations. And we certainly learned that during a time of crisis, nonprofits step up and are most responsive. But we have to understand that nonprofits are critical in good times and in bad. So that sort of lays out why we became involved.
Thank you. So flipping over to our philanthropy partners, Jackie, can you share with us what your experience has been?
Sure, Lois. So let me just share a little bit about the Pascale Sykes Foundation. Our agency, our foundation, focuses on empowering working low-income families in New Jersey and parts of New York so that they can collectively strengthen their relationships and establish stability and reach their dreams. And the reason why I think it matters is because this is a team effort, and nonprofits, community partners are closest to the issues, and we need to hear their voices. And it's critical that we start that communication or expand on that communication. And why the urgency of this? It's long overdue. And that's pretty much it. From how I see it, it's just long overdue.
Okay, thank you. Samantha.
Thank you. So the Provident Bank Foundation was established to provide grants to nonprofit organizations that are working to improve quality of life across Provident Bank's marketplace, which as of a merger in 2020 now includes 18 counties across 3 states. So from Eastern Pennsylvania into Queens, New York, and across the northern 2/3 of the state of New Jersey. And so the reason why, trust-based philanthropy in particular means so much to us as a foundation is, I have to fly 30,000 feet up. That's kind of my line, right? I can't be as involved in every single community that we fund the same way our nonprofit partners do. So I know I'm not the subject matter expert in these communities. And it is so important for me to make sure that as we're having conversations and opening ourselves up to feedback, that we're getting the true knowledge of what's happening in our communities from the people who are there every single day doing the work. And so that change is something that we started to work on really mid-COVID, which I think is probably when a lot of foundations really kicked this into gear, even though it may have been kind of a thought that they wanted to get there, but it has proved to be just a wonderful way for us to do our grant making and for us to continue to build relationships in our communities and make, meaningful impact with our investments.
So I see the vision, I hear the vision of the dream world of being able to implement new power dynamics. What is preventing us from getting there? So there's a couple of parts to that question. For foundations, help us take the veil, lift the veil behind the scenes. Why can't we do what we say we want to do? And for nonprofits, why do you sometimes not feel like you can trust and share some of the details of the challenges that you face? Really, how can we develop trust and shared objectives together in this reality that we are in? So let's start with, I'm going to put the foundations on the spot first. So Samantha, you're still up.
All right. So I think for so long, foundations, or at least in our case at the Provident Bank Foundation, we're receiving so many grant requests every year that we needed something concrete to say, this level of investment into this organization equals this amount of impact. And for so long, we felt that impact was only trackable through quantitative measures. But I think what we're really coming to find out, especially as our expertise in terms of our staffing has changed over the past few years, and our board's willingness to kind of open themselves up to it some more, is understanding that impact is not just the number of people you're serving or the amount of contact hours you have with someone in your community. It's really about everything else that goes into the work, the feel-good qualitative measures and not just the hard numbers. And so we still have metrics and things to make sure that our funding aligns and the groups we work with align with what we want our funding priorities to be. So organizations for us still have to be creating impact in a community where Provident Bank has a physical location. That's never going to change. But the things that we do try and be flexible on year over year is the need in the community, and making sure that when we make our decisions, it's based on a knowledge of the research that we've done, the conversations we've had with our grant partners, to make sure that our funding is really addressing those really critical needs in our community. But again, for the longest time, I think we weren't asking the question of our grantee partners. We weren't saying, okay, what is the need? What are you seeing? We were thinking we knew what we knew was church, and that wasn't necessarily the case. So I think that has prevented us for a long time in really hearing what our nonprofit partners saying and then acting upon it.
Jackie, you have anything to add?
Sure, I would say some of what Samantha has already said, but I also think that sometimes maybe it's just the unwillingness because people are uncomfortable, about possibly losing control. And then also think that, it depends on who is on your board and who those people are and their knowledge of the communities in which you want to fund in. And I think if you're not mindful of how you attract people to your board based on your mission, I think you lose out, you know.
Right, and I think that really does depend. Family foundations have a board that's family. They're
Yes.
born into the board. And that's really, really been an opportunity for me to learn now that I'm at a family foundation.
Right, yeah.
So good points. So Mark and George, tell us, you know, how does it feel to be on the other end with regard to trust and trusting foundations? Okay, Mark, you're smiling. I'm going with you.
Yeah, well, like, you know, I'm trying to defer to George. I got the first one last time. But a couple things. I mean, I had an experience in a previous organization I ran where, you know, our largest funder, we had applied for a very specific program. It was, you know, it was a multi-year $300,000 grant. It was perfect for the kind of thing we were trying to do. And it was a great idea. The problem was, after we were awarded the grant, we realized that other people had done basically the same thing. And there was absolutely no need for us to spend 3 years developing a program that already had been developed in San Diego, and we could simply import those materials with a little bit of training. And so we contacted the funder. They said they fully understood. They allowed us to sort of redirect the funds to what they thought was most appropriate. And so from very early on, I was spoiled with that relationship, because they 100% understood, why would we spend our money replicating something that's already been done? Let's put that money to work and still accomplish the goals that we were trying to accomplish. And so, you know, I think that in answer to the question, the reason we don't go back to funders and say, well, you know, thanks for the money, but what we really want is this, is that we're afraid that the funders are simply going to say, oh, so sorry, you know, my board says that's what we funded, and you're going to have to return that money. And that's, you know, that's every nonprofit's, you know, worst nightmare, right? You don't want to lose money that you thought you had.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I guess, you know, what I would say is think, and if we can convince trustees to think of this, think of the outcomes as more broadly. I mean, we don't have to totally eliminate metrics, right? When you buy Starbucks stock, you're not necessarily buying every single store. You're not necessarily buying pumpkin spice latte or any specific product that they offer. You are buying the overall company's success. And the same should be viewed when you invest in a nonprofit through general operating support. So, you know, when a funder funds us with general operating support, they're not just funding our preschool programs, which are really wonderful and highly successful and all that. They're not funding our food bank. They're not funding our job training programs or the shiny new building that we're producing. They're buying all of it. Mm-hmm. And they get credit for all of it, because without that support, we wouldn't have the capacity to do that work. And so if you see the investment in a nonprofit as you would see purchasing stock in a corporation, you get to take credit for all of it. And so, you know, what I would say is, you know, if I'm going to look at a nonprofit before I invest, I want to know what kind of outcomes are they producing. I want to know how good their financials are. Are they strong? Are they healthy? Do they need some help? I want to know, can maybe my money, can it help them get more donors? So maybe I don't have to invest forever. And then, you know, do they have the systems in place to continue to be successful and continue to replicate those outcomes? That's what I'd want to know, you know, if I were Bill Gates and had $1 billion.
George.
Yeah, so, you know, 100% ditto to Mark's sentiments there. But two thoughts, and coming from maybe two different vantage points. So one thought is to the question of why, you know, nonprofits might be resistant, or there's some trust concerns there. I mean, first is there's some really antiquated thinking in how funding is allocated. You know, we have to come to terms in understanding that nonprofit organizations are in fact a business. They are an organization. They need CFOs, they need marketing, they need communications efforts, they have to pay for office space. So this notion of restricting these overly restrictive caps on, you know, general admin, and frankly, I would hope that we get rid of those two words, G&A, or those two letters, and come to grips with what it takes for a nonprofit organization to operate, right? So that's a real concern, and it does limit, you know, to some extent, in how nonprofits, you know, report their work financially, programmatically, because the concern of, you know, how much is falling into that G&A bucket and how it affects, you know, their funding, their audit, and so forth. That's a major concern that we have to address. The other vantage point is, you know, can we look at some more shared accountability, right? Funders hold us accountable, right? And we could get into the whole thing of how that accountability is so disparate and how onerous it is on, you know, and I think of, you know, NORWESCAP market as a community action agency. You have your community action requirements that you need to comply with and report, right? And you probably have 60 other funders, and those reporting requirements are all in these separate silos, right? So we get, you know, it's borderline insanity in terms of how much reporting and compliance that we're on the hook for. You know, guess what? Why don't you foundations, why don't you consider a similar sort of regular accountability measures? I know, Lois, you yourself with some of your work have attempted that, particularly at the top of the pandemic, in terms of some sort of scorecard and how we responded to disaster relief efforts. You know, from a CDO5 standpoint, we have listened to our regulators and to our trade association, Opportunity Finance Network, where we participate every year in a peer-by-peer comparison. You know, we get compared, we get mirrored against other CDO5s who are similar to us from a market standpoint, from an operational standpoint, and of course, scope of work standpoint. And every year we get the scorecard of how we compare against those similar CDO5s. And it doesn't really affect our audit, our S&P rating, our Aries rating. It doesn't affect those sort of those regulatory requirements that we're on the hook for, but it does affect how we go about you know, making decisions internally and say, hey, listen, against enterprise, against the reinvestment fund, other fantastic CDO5s, we're not necessarily hitting the marks in some of these key performance benchmarks. You know, why not foundations consider a similar approach?
Right. Accountability. Yep. So going to what I believe it was Theresa shared earlier, and a report that the Center for Effective Philanthropy did a study in November of 2021 that said that virtually all foundation leaders say their foundations are working differently now than in early 2020. Most frequently report streamlining processes to reduce the burden on grantees and providing unrestricted support, changes they say they will sustain. Is that happening in New Jersey? Do you believe that? And is it being sustained, or are you seeing things revert back? So I will start with George, since you're still up.
So I think it's too intermittent and it's too sporadic. I mean, I will give credit to some funders who have stepped up, and frankly, I think those funders who were beginning to look at trust-based principles and racial equity well before the pandemic, well before the murder of George Floyd and the so-called racial reckoning, are the same funders that we see being most consistent in how they go about their work. And I think it's being reflected in not just individual kind of one-off grant programs. It's really based on how they go about going about all their work, right? So how they go about from an operational standpoint, how they're recruiting for their board, how they're recruiting for their staff, right? So internally, the sort of changes that they're making to really realize that commitment to equity. as well as how it not only affects individual grant programs, but how they go about certain grant review processes to live within that equity lens. So to the question, it is happening, but I think it's happening too sporadically. But I think it's really based on those funders that, again, were very much very much committed to equity well before the pandemic.
And I'm gonna add to the question. Has it made a difference for those funders that you see doing it differently? For you, is it making it different?
100%. It is making a significant difference. It just so happens that those particular funders happen to be our signature funders, our principal investors. So it is making a substantial difference. And we know that difference is in place now and in place for quite a few years to come.
So Mark, is your experience similar to George's?
Yeah, I would say that a few funders really are. I mean, they are, in fact, we were just awarded a foundation grant from a relatively new foundation that was specifically for general operating support. And there's folks, some of our signature funders and traditional funders have been doing that as well over the last couple of years. So it does make a difference. And I'll give you the example. When I came to NORWESCAP, it was a wonderful organization, had really stable funding, a lot of large government grants, had some big supporters. But we were siloed, as George was mentioning. And what we realized was our programs weren't being as effective as they could be in terms of driving outcomes, because our Head Start parents weren't necessarily receiving our LIHEAP support, and our LIHEAP folks weren't necessarily being talked to about potentially accessing WIC benefits. And people coming to our partner food pantries weren't necessarily hearing about all those things. And you can't tell me, if you're coming to me and saying, I can't pay for my oil this month, that you might not also need housing assistance or something else. So we had to build an infrastructure across all, our entire organization. And how are we going to pay for that? Well, you pay for that with general operating support, with unrestricted funds. George said a magic word, which I'm now drawing a blank on. We created something called an engagement partner. And an engagement partner is essentially a case manager that goes, that can, when you come into NORWESCAP, you used to come in as a Head Start participant. You used to come in as a WIC participant. Well, now you come in and you sign up with NORWESCAP. Oh, and that's what George mentioned. Talk about ridiculous reporting systems. We have 28 different data systems that we report to. We are audited by any number of organizations on the regular. I mean, it's probably, a different agency a month. And so all that administrative time, first of all, nobody pays for administration, right? But, takes away from driving program outcomes. And so, that goal, that general operating support, allowed us to build a program that combines our services and support, and frankly helped us build an IT infrastructure so we could measure outcomes. What does every funder want? They want better transparency on what their dollars are getting. We can now deliver that. I can tell them how happy our clients are with us because we measure client satisfaction. We couldn't do that 3 years ago, but because of sort of this change in philosophy, we've been able to fund it and support it. And it's still, it's still a work in progress, but that's what you get when you get funders that are listening to what you're saying, listening to what the needs are. And I think my advantage was I was new to a well-established agency, and people were interested to hear, well, what's going to be different, what's going to change. So I had a leg up on most folks who haven't established relationships. So, that's the kind of change you can drive at an organization when you're flexible.
So Samantha and Jackie, having just heard George and Mark share how those practices have made such a difference to them, how have you responded in your particular cases? Either one can jump in. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay.
So at the Pascale Sykes Foundation, we've always given, not to say always, but in the last 10 years, we've given multi-year grants, and which has been great. And that's the great thing that we've done. Now, while we've given multi-year grants, there are some things that we've done that does not fit with best practices and doing good better as well. So, we've done, multi-year grants. We've also, streamlined our application process. I was really surprised. We went from probably about 8-9 pages, 10 pages of reporting process to one application. But this was all doing because of COVID. And I often wondered, would we be able to continue that? Or was it just a trend and a fad and we were going along with what everyone else was doing at that time? And how were we really looking to put in place long-term, changes that would sustain over time? And I think that because our foundation is sunsetting at the end of the year, I do believe that if we had more time, I think based on some of the best trust-based practices we've seen, and we know that are working, I do believe that we may have been able to do more around that. Because I think some of the things that we were doing was really requiring too much time from nonprofits to spend time on that area where we're not funding, but we want all these reporting process forms for. So, yeah.
Samantha, anything to add, contribute?
Yeah, just really to echo the sentiment that, we also felt like we were just asking too much of our applicants and our grantees once they actually did receive the funding. So it's something that we started even before I became executive director in my previous role with the foundation, really making ourselves more transparent. So we started putting, the questions for our letters of intent and application in the grant guidelines so groups could preview that beforehand, which we felt would at least help an organization determine whether they felt they had the answers to the types of questions we were looking for, even if things were still a little heavy on the question asking. And then we took a look at that and said, okay, what questions do we really need to be asking, and what answers do we really need to have to make the decisions on our funding? And then once we funded the organizations, we wanted them to just do the work. Now, we didn't want to completely go radio silent after handing over the money. So we still have, Zoom check-ins, or we volunteer, or we, do site visits, or we, if there's, an event or that's part of our funding that we can participate in as well, we like to go and engage in that way. And that's just, for us, really changed, I think, how our relationships have been building with our grantee partners. And it's definitely something that we are keeping forever. I love it so much. I love the way we do our funding so much now that I'm always thinking about, okay, what's the next thing? What else are we going to do? What's 2023 going to look like? What's 2025 going to look like? How are we going to continue to be a better, more responsive, more respectful funder of our grantee partners, and making sure that they have what they need to do the work, and really just trust that our investments are going to be used well, because they have been since we've started making these changes. It's been amazing, almost 3 full funding years of doing things this way. So I love it, and I hope more funders will get on board with it.
Fabulous. So we use the word trust a lot so far. So let's kind of define trust-based philanthropy practices. And actually, in addition to trust-based, that's, the new fad, participatory grant making is another word that is being used right now, or principles. So trust-based elements are encouraging funders to give multi-year unrestricted funding, for funders to do the homework, to do research on the internet, and to do, the due diligence, so that we don't have to have the educational burden on the nonprofit organization, to simplify and streamline our paperwork, to be transparent and responsive. That's even in volume. We have a commitment at Raskob that every phone call and every email gets responded to. Solicit and act upon feedback. So actually asking our grantees or the community, even if they're not our grantee, what is it that they need and how are we doing in meeting those needs and in meeting your, the other is to offer support beyond the check. Participatory philanthropy puts the decision-making closer to the ground. It's taking that power away from the person with the resources and saying to the people on the ground, what do you need? And how would you go about either designing a program or allocating the resources themselves? It's encouraging community involvement or ensuring the voice of people with lived experience are at the decision-making table. So we've talked a lot about some of these practices. Any that you want to elaborate on that you say, number one, if you could do this, it would be fabulous. George.
So, so I'm going to come at it from two tracks if I can. So, so I'm going to give you know, props to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, at least the New Jersey office, in forming what's known as the JEGNA Council. So it's a statewide council of folks, and I've been fortunate to be one of the folks on this council who are working very closely with the state director and the team there to determine what are the what's the best design and the best deployment of their grant making activities. They've established 3 pillars. They have 3 pillars that they've already sort of predetermined, but they've been able to engage folks like myself and other key community-based nonprofits and other stakeholders who are closer to the ground and directly advising the foundations and the state team to you know, understand how those grant dollars are, you know, should be deployed. That's, you know, this sort of approach, a sort of model I would very much like to see many of our foundations apply. I know we do have quite a few advisory councils, particularly with some of our bank and financial funders. I mean, that's more related to kind of Community Reinvestment Act, you know, compliance, as Samantha well knows. But I think to have that more substantive involvement is a sort of approach that that makes a lot of sense. That's the one track. The other track is, you know, just me doing a little bit of organizational back padding to some extent. You know, LISC, you know, we through again, through our commitment to uplifting community voices, you know, we established a what's referred to as our Thriving Neighborhoods Initiative, Neighbors Helping Neighborhoods grant program. It's a small grant program from, you know, from $1,000 to $25,000 to support resident developed and resident-led projects. We have resident leaders within our, you know, 2 particular target neighborhoods who are on the grant review committee. So they're directly involved in reviewing, scoring, and recommending what particular, you know, grants to support. So we're doing our best to live, you know, this participatory philanthropy approach. And again, giving props to Robert Johnson Foundation for taking that sort of, you know, fairly new approach.
Okay. Jackie and Samantha, are you engaging with any of the participatory or the trust-based principles, of which ones would you highlight as being the best thing since sliced bread? Jackie?
Well, as I said, I do think that the multi-year grant funding is really important, because just as, you know, agencies start to, you give them a 1-year prop funding and then they can't sustain that, they just begin to do the work. And so that it really requires more time. And I think when the foundation, the Pascale Sykes Foundation decided to spin down their funds, the president decided we were going to give multi-year grants, and multi-year grants. In fact, we funded some nonprofits who didn't even exist until the foundation came into, expanded into the southern region of the state to say, and we had these public hearings to say, you know, what's going on, what are the needs in the community? And what came back was, you know, hearing from the people in the community. And there were a lot of people, boots on the ground, that were grassroots organizations that actually are now nonprofits, because the foundation did listen to what the community was saying about what they need and really assisted with that. So in giving them multi-year grants out the door, which really helped establish them, which was, I think, is great. And I think that was I think the strongest thing that we've done, and also encourage collaboration with those nonprofits in the community so that, you know, they could kind of pull their resources and also even apply to foundations as a collaboration, because when you have so many agencies coming to, you know, foundations asking for funding for the same thing, so collaboration was really important as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. And I would say, you know, the 3 of the 6 trust-based philanthropy principles that I find were the easiest for us to start with, first and foremost, was us being more transparent and communicating out and putting everything we possibly could out there about our assessment criteria. As I mentioned, the questions on our applications, put everything out there and say, these are the things we fund, these are the things we don't fund, this is our geography, this is how specific we go, just to make sure that everyone understood who we are. Because, you know, philanthropy, we as a funder, I can't be the funder for every organization, for every program. I still have guidelines and things that I have to follow, but I can at least make it as simple as possible for you to identify whether or not you feel like we would be a good match for each other. And then opening my door to having conversations with organizations who weren't sure or who wanted to run things by me or thought they might be on the fence. So scheduling a 30-minute Zoom discovery call, just chat with people, or responding to emails and just providing whatever feedback we can. And remembering that, you know, development folks and smaller organizations where the executive director is also the grant writer, is also the reporting contact and all these things, sometimes just having a conversation is simpler than even reading through a 4-page guidelines document. So having those conversations and opening ourselves up was key. Also opening up our funding to be more full cost funding, even if you're not able to fully jump into unrestricted funding or general operating support, even if that seems a little scary. If you still want to focus on programs or projects or initiatives, at least understand that investing in the people who are running those programs is as important as helping to purchase supplies or other direct program expenses. So at least starting to open your funding up a little bit more to address the full cost of running a program is something that I think is easy to really kind of wrap your arms around when you think about what it takes to run a program. And then simplifying and streamlining paperwork is high up there. I mean, again, we looked at the questions we were asking and saying, which ones do we actually come back to and stick out in our minds when we are going to make a decision, or when we have to weigh, we have these 3 requests but can only fund 1. What answers to which questions is most critical in helping us to make those decisions, and then just asking those questions. And same with reporting, you know, we don't make the metrics that an organization is trying to align to. We don't tell them what outputs or outcomes we want to see. You let us know what it is that you think you're going to track, and then let us know how you did at the end of the grant term. Was it successful? Was it not? Why or why not? What would have made things more successful, or what were surprising, you know, opportunities that came about? Again, it's more not just about those hard numbers, but overall, what was kind of the feeling? And I think all of that becomes easier for us to understand how that translates to impact when we also understand and respect what it is that we're funding.
Great. So you're perfect lead in to saying it's not an all or nothing proposition, right? That we can start small and don't, you know, so that we can start. So some of the thoughts we have around what are some of the goals. And I will say, I'm going to go to George and Mark again. Listening to Samantha and to Jackie, in what they're talking about, where do you think would make it most helpful if we started small? What would be a small thing that would be a great, easy win for you?
I think simplifying the application process certainly helps. I mean, streamlining and Samantha is 100% sort of, I don't want to say sincere, but like that is exactly how she approached this. When we talked to her in Provident, it was a conversation. It was about what do you guys do? What are your outcomes? And literally it was a conversation. So I think that is relatively simple thing to do. But I want to just push a little more on what's not so simple. And that is rethink the whole thing, right? Because when you're giving away your money, what do you want? What do you want? You want change, right? So you want community change. What is the outcome that you're seeking? So instead of thinking of yourself as a funder, right, or your trustees, instead of thinking themselves as funders, think of themselves as a partner driving community change.
You're reading my notes, I tell you.
Yeah, well, but that's what it is, right? And so the term, I don't like trust-based philanthropy, because to me that suggests that maybe there wasn't so much trust before. But if you're a partner, you come in and you're Samantha Plotino from Provident Bank, and what your bank is really interested in is building the financial skills of low-income folks who are struggling or have bad debt, right? Find some organizations that are already doing that, organizations on the ground. Don't make any commitments. Don't put out an RFP. Talk to 10 or 15 of them and figure out who are gonna be the people we can invest in to achieve our result. I'm just picking on Samantha because she's there. She's on the right on the squares. But if you approach it from a stewardship kind of thoughts mindset, right? That you are a steward for some kind of community change that you and your fellow trustees or your philanthropy is excited about, then find partners who are going to help you achieve the results. People who have a track record of doing it or have the sort of the capacity to do that kind of work. And then it's not just about your money. Maybe you can only offer $25,000 to, foment world peace. But you might be able, as a steward rather than as a funder, be able to bring in some other funders or some other stakeholders. I mean, in the end, the philanthropic community is small compared to what the public sector can do. So bring in public sector partners and help them extend your investment. So to me, that's about smart investing. I mean, Elon Musk didn't make Tesla out of nothing. He got big government grants during the financial crisis that were targeted at green technology. That helped build Tesla. So it wasn't just him and a bunch of rich partners. It was the public sector also stepping in. So to me, it's about that stewardship mindset. How do we achieve the results that we're all committed to achieving? And then let's go find partners and let's go out and get it. That's sorry. That's
okay.
Away from the easy stuff. That's the big stuff. But one easy thing I could recommend is what, again, go back to Robert Wood Johnson and their New Jersey Health Initiatives child. They brought their grantees together on a regular basis, a couple times a year, for training, for workshops, and sometimes just to exchange information and best practices. They might bring in an outside speaker. They might have each of the grantees talk a little bit about what's been successful and what has not been. And we all learned in that process. The program officer, the grants officer, all the nonprofits, we're all stealing each other's ideas and picking each other's brains. So that's an easy way to do it. The harder way to do it is to start putting some low-income people and maybe some of your grantees on the board.
Closing with that, Marco, are you? George.
So yes, I got to follow Mark after that was strong, Mark. It's great stuff. So I'm not sure if it's an early or an easy win, Lois, but I would start with that the initial goal in terms of awarding multi-year generating operating, so but taking a step further and going back to what we previously discussed in rethinking how dollars should be allocated. So and not just in terms of looking at administrative G&A limitations, but even in how nonprofits can allocate the dollars, especially for reserve or endowment purposes. What I find amazing is, going back to my days in New Jersey Community Capital, and even more recently, when a disaster strikes, even our most established, high quality, high responsive disaster relief agencies have to wait 2, 3, sometimes a full week before they can get this sort of initial support, so they can mobilize people, mobilize phone systems, call centers. So I had, a disaster relief provider approach us saying, can we apply for a line of credit that we can establish as a reserve so that when an emergency hits, we can just draw from it immediately? Because obviously when an emergency hits, whether it's the pandemic to Hurricane Ida, or whatever it might be, every second counts, right? So, but I think that sort of logic can be applied to, how we, again, rethink how dollars could be less restrictive and more flexible and nimble to really address nonprofits work on a day-to-day basis, but also in the case of crisis, or to have that sort of long-term, bucket of money when needed. So that's, I think that's a fairly easy win. I think the other somewhat, fairly simple to do is, and we've been fortunate to be the beneficiary of, funders helping us to tell the story. Nonprofits are, as we all know, are somewhat limited in terms of how we can communicate our work and tell the many success stories of individual families, projects, small businesses that we help. So, being able to work with funders, with their communication resources and expertise to help, tell the story. And, the last thing I will stress, and this is not so easy, but it is important, and Mark sort of alluded to it, is, and again, kind of coming at this again from this ecosystem building, this cross-sector collaborative frame, right? Coming from that work. But also helping with some policy advocacy efforts. We're really at a unique and special moment in time, right? So with the pandemic efforts and the long-term economic recovery efforts, we're going to be in this mode for quite some time. And we have a really unique opportunity with all this rescue plan money that's coming in now and the previous COVID relief money. There's a real opportunity to join forces across sector, from philanthropy to government to nonprofit, how we can collectively, come together. But we need to support each other to, look at certain, key policies to loosen up certain restrictions and rules. So policy advocacy efforts is a great need as well.
So I am mindful that we're coming up to our time, and I wanted to give you one word or one quick closing thought from each of you, and it's a lightning round. So we're going to go with Samantha.
Continue to give us your feedback and know that we're listening.
All right, Mark.
Partnership.
Jackie.
I say partnership and collaboration. I cheated.
And George.
Yeah, together, same sort of spirit, together.
That's fabulous. I love that spontaneity. That wasn't on script. So good job, team. And that really is, I so appreciate, and we appreciate the invitation to speak with New Jersey VOAD and with the Governor's House Office of Volunteerism. It's just really been a privilege to talk about how we're really trying to work together and change a system that's been pretty set in its ways and not functioning really healthfully.
Right.
To make some good change together. But together, all those words that you just shared is really how we're going to approach this differently this time. So with that, we want to say thank you and everybody to have a joyful day.